Dar liks turbūt paskui.
I'm a little bit shorter than the last person who stood behind this podium.
So look, it's my pleasure in this session. I get to be irresponsible. I get to be what's called a fire starter. I'm going to say some things about the work that we've done, and then I'm going to leave and let other people talk to you about and debate the issues. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the challenge of carbon footprinting in food. But let me begin by just putting this into perspective. So these are the environmental impacts that we know about from the food system. So we see that it accounts for about 50% of land is used for agriculture, 73% of deforestation, 80% biodiversity loss, 70% of global freshwater use, 78% in terms of eutrophication. But the one I'm going to focus on today, which is climate change and human-caused emissions. So globally, we can see that most of the impacts from the food systems actually occur at the agricultural production stage. So from land and land use change and through the actual production. That's by far the majority, that's 70% of food-related emissions come from the ag and production stage. But not all products are equal, and this gives you some sense of which are the most carbon intensive, and these are averages. So on average, you can see that livestock products, especially meat and beef, are much more carbon intensive than plant-based products, as you see on the bottom. And we can see that ruminants such as bovine meat are more carbon intensive than other types of meat such as poultry and pork. But as I mentioned, those are averages. So within those averages, actually, we can see there's a big difference between producers, and that can be even producers within the same country. So that white dot shows the global median, and the grey line is the range between the 10% of best performing and the 10% of worst performing producers in terms of the carbon footprint. So the message really from this slide is that we actually need to be able to move beyond the averages and move to the specifics. And why? Well, because if we had the specific information, we could actually activate these levers. We could get people to shift to those lower impact product categories. We could shift within those categories to the best performing producers in terms of carbon emissions. And most importantly, we would be incentivizing producers to move towards being in that category of lower impact. So, this is what that means in terms of what we saw. So the first lever is maybe we move down the list. Now, this is also no one size fits all. In some parts of the world, people don't get enough protein. So in other parts, they're eating way too much. So this is a broad story, but I would stress that global part. It also allows us to go along this list for the producers. It allows us to shift inside the grey bar to the better producers. And it allows us to shift the entire distribution in terms of our consumption. And there are lots of public and private initiatives aimed at pulling those levers. They can range from carbon pricing through to green public procurement, through to labelling initiatives. But the bottom line is that if we want to be serious about mitigation, we need to be able to measure it. You can't mitigate what you're not measuring. So what that means is if we're going to be able to make progress, we need three things. We need to understand impacts on carbon footprint at the product level, and that's a life cycle across all stages. We need to understand at the firm level impact, and that's both from the farm, but also along the supply chain. And we need to know the impact of actions that we take to reduce. Where's the biggest bang for the buck? What makes the difference? And the hard thing is not only do we need that information, we need it to be consistent, we need it to be country comparable, we need it to be transparent, and we need it to be reliable. So the good news is that we're seeing actually quite a lot of activity in this realm. And we're seeing that activity because there's three big drivers out there. The first is we're seeing demand. We're seeing demand from consumers who are increasingly making decisions in this way. We're seeing demand from investors, from governments, and also from civil society. We're equally seeing demand from we're also seeing supply that comes from this demand is pushing people to develop new calculation tools, new evidence and data, platforms are being created, new technological solutions, and some interesting things that you'll hear about in the next day or so happening in the digital space, and new reporting standards. And this is taking place against a background where governments, as we talked a little bit about this morning, are already thinking much more about supply chains in general. They're thinking about traceability, transparency along supply chains. And there's also more of a focus in terms of policy making on paying not for processes, not for inputs, but for outcomes and results. So there's a lot of good trends here that lead us to seeing a lot of activity. And what I'm going to talk about is the work that my colleagues have done as well on a paper we called Fast and Furious. And we called it Fast and Furious because there's so much activity happening. But it's also a lot of activity that comes with some risks that we need to talk about as well. So the first is we see a huge number of carbon labels that are proliferating everywhere. And indeed, we see consumers are starting to make choices based on what is on these labels or what they think is sustainable. At the same time, we see that some of these labels are also covering multiple environmental outcomes. And this is the kind of information that is becoming very popular with consumers, but do we know what this information is? If this is shaping consumer decisions, it's really important that this information makes sense, that this information is accurate. At the same time, this is not just coming from consumers, this is also coming from global investors. So here's an example of one initiative called the FAIR Initiative. And this brings together a whole lot of global investment managers. So this is 70 trillion of assets managed. And they're not looking for greater transparency from protein producer companies because of altruism. They're doing it because they see and they recognize that this is a business risk, that especially depending on what happens with government regulation, companies need to be ready. So they are asking their companies, how ready are you? And this is a little bit like what Augustus was saying before about making environmentally sustainable business sustainable, economically sustainable. But it's also not just investors. What we're seeing is a large amount of activism by retailers as well. So this is a number of retailers who are reporting what we call Scope 3 emissions. So Scope 1 reporting is your own direct emissions. Scope 2 is from the energy sources that you buy. And Scope 3 is upstream and downstream on your supply chain. And this is the requirement. Some of these are targets for reduction. Some of them are just reporting requirements to have some kind of measurement or science-based measurement of emissions. But this is becoming a real push from many retailers. The other push is coming from public policy and governments. And you'll see this is early days, this is coming up. There's proposals in the United States for firms with securities that are traded in the US to have to disclose Scope 3. There's also using, again, as I mentioned, the public procurement angle. Within the EU, there's debates about whether large firms will be required to disclose and report Scope 3 emissions, but also, again, about green claims, that when you make those claims on the label, that they have to be backed up by an actual life cycle analysis. And in Latin America, we see a number of countries getting together to have mutual recognition when they use the sustainability label. So this is basically this public policy environment. We're seeing a circle. The idea of government regulation is creating the demand for investors to say to companies, you need to be starting to report on this. Companies start to report, and then consumers start to pay attention and say, well, what is on that label? And maybe this is what I want to buy. So this is a simplified picture to try and give you a bit of a sense of what's going on. And we move from the general to the specific. On the left-hand side, we're really looking at sort of firm-level kinds of initiatives, and on the right-hand side, for product-level kinds of initiatives. So the reason that we're trying to do this is just to give you a kind of map of what's going on. So at the base level, we have quite general standards. There's the Global Reporting Initiative, there's the International Financial Reporting Standards Federation, that sets the global rules for financial accounting, and of course we have ISO that you know. And that's a general environmental reporting level looking at life cycle. At the next level up, we start to see some initiatives which are more specifically targeted at greenhouse gases. So there you see the Greenhouse Gas Protocol, some specific initiatives as well by ISO, and that's both at firm level on the left-hand side and heading towards product level on the right. The Pact, at the next one up, we wanted to highlight because Pact actually requires more detailed, it provides more detailed guidance for companies on how you report those Scope 3 supply chain emissions. And at the next level up, so the bottom three is still all at the kind of the general level. Then we go up to the things that are actually targeting the agri-food sector, because the agri-food sector is moving quite fast in this space. And there we see that there's the Greenhouse Gas Protocol has given some actual guidance in terms of land sector and removals within the agri-food sector. And we also see that FAO, the LEAP guidelines, apply to livestock. Next level up again, and we see some even more specific that drill down. So the US Dairy Federation provides very specific guidance for dairy producers, and we also see that there are similar initiatives by the International Dairy Federation and also by the Global Roundtable for Sustainable Beef. So all this activity, and right at the top is our cow. Is our cow standing in a field? And we want to ask that cow, how much methane is that cow emitting? And that is the one question actually we can't answer. Because at the moment, we can't, at the farm level, measure exactly how much methane is coming from that cow. So what's happening is we use models, we use proxies, we use simplified systems to try and come up with a system that is actually usable. So the good news is there's a huge amount of activity happening here, that people see that this is important, consumers see it's important, business sees it's important. The bad news is there's a huge amount of activity here. And the risk is that we won't end up with collaboration, we'll end up with fragmentation. And that's a risk not just in terms of business costs and fragmentation, it's a risk because we risk not getting the environmental impacts that we're trying to achieve. And we also risk consumers just saying, look, it's all too confusing, I don't know what any of it means, and we lose that lever of consumers. So the other way, and this is one of the things that we're trying to think about at the OECD, is can we do better than this? How can we do this? How can we help countries that when we bring different stakeholders together to just answer some basic questions? So if I want to put up a sign in my country that says Julia's Sustainable Hamburgers, who regulates that? Is it the government? Is it the private sector? Is it public-private? Is it no one? What do I have to prove when I make that claim that my hamburgers are sustainable? And is that the same as what other people are asking? And how is that being measured? And what's the global best practice in measuring it? So one of the things that we've tried to do to start this work and this conversation is we worked with our partners at the World Economic Forum and business at OECD to talk to some of the private sector about what are you doing in measuring emissions. And this looks across three sectors, from mining and steel, but also agri-food, and says, what's the challenge? And part of the challenge is these different reporting that comes from the fact that there's different sources of data and there's different quality of data. It's particularly challenging in agri-food because of fragmentation. You have 600 million farms worldwide. You have a huge amount of variability in farms in terms of what you can measure, what might be. You have a big issue of comparability in different approaches. And you also have, because you have so many small players, an issue about capacity to provide data. So methodology matters, but so does the fact that when you're trying to come up with a system or find ways to make this work across countries, we're calling, I guess, for a pragmatic way forward in this dialogue. We need something that is reasonably accurate enough. It's not going to be perfect. We need something that is actually feasible, so there'll be a trade-off between accuracy and feasibility, because you need something that can be implemented, and you need something that can be interoperable across countries, or that where countries can talk to each other. So we're trying to talk with stakeholders, we're talking with governments, we're talking with the private sector about what can we all do to create those forces that move towards interoperability and coordination and away from fragmentation. So having thrown out the problem, let me leave it to smarter people to solve it. Thank you.